actually helping NASA with their mission to Venus. But David is also something that he calls a science communicator working in the field of science communication. And so David and his colleagues think very critically and analytically about how scientific information needs to be conveyed through various media in order to best affect public policy and public understandings of science. And the more I got to talking with David, the more I started to ask myself, why doesn't history do this? Why don't we have something called history communication? And why aren't we training people to be history communicators? Why aren't we thinking critically and analytically about how history gets conveyed through various media in order to best affect public policy and public understandings of history? So in the 2015-2016 time period, I actually suggested this to my colleagues in the history profession. I suggested that we should have something called history communicators, and that we should train people in the field of history communication. Now, this probably will ring familiar to you, right? Because right now, you guys are involved with strategic communication training, thinking about how to train government communicators to be effective in this social media environment. So this was the idea for history and history communication and history communicators back, 6-7 years ago already now. So this, idea, it kind of generated some debate in the profession. Was this something that we really needed? Was this something that was going to be helpful to the field? Was this something that historians were already doing? But in the meantime, again, 2015, 2016 time period we're talking now, a lot of history content was starting to show up online. Content such as this video. Now, I'm going to use American examples and English language examples for much of my slides here, but you can imagine how these relate to the context that you operate in. So this is a video that came out in 2015, and it's a video that is about the US Civil War, which happened between 1861 and 1865. This video received 30 to 40 million views online. Now, to put that in perspective, I told you that I wrote a book. Did you know that 95% of all books never sell more than 1,000 copies? My book has sold more than 1,000 copies. That puts it in the top 5% of all books. The average academic journal article in the humanities and social sciences is not cited by 82% of people, or is never cited 82% of the time, excuse me. So if I was to write an article about the Civil War or a book about the Civil War, chances are a lot of people wouldn't read it or wouldn't see it. But a video about the Civil War can get 30 to 40 million views online. Now, again, this is 2015, 2016 time period, right? So clearly something was going on here, something was happening where there was all this history content proliferating online, affecting the way people understood the world and about their history. And some of it was generating a lot of eyeballs, a lot of attention, and a lot of influence. So the question was, well, what is all this stuff? What is really going on here? And of course, it wasn't just this video, right? There was all kinds of other stuff popping up online. This is just a section of it. But of course, stuff like this in your own context, in your own languages, in your own countries will look very familiar. History content popping up on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Telegram, on WhatsApp. I mean, all over the social web, history content everywhere. And no one was writing about it. I mean, if we think back to 2015, 2016, 2017 time period, there was a lot of discussion about social media and its effects on politics, its effects on science, its effects on journalism, during the pandemic, effects on COVID-19, but no one was writing or looking at how history was being shaped by the web and what all this history content online was doing to people's understandings of the past. Now, you might be asking yourself, okay, so there's history content online, but how much of content are we really talking about? Is this really a big category of content on the web worth taking seriously? Well, I was thinking the same thing, so I set out to try to answer that question. Now, we all know there's a lot of information on the internet, but sometimes I feel like it's very helpful to see it as a graph. So this graph is from 2018. In 2018, so 5 years ago, YouTube users watched 4.3 million videos every minute of every day. I'm going to say that again, 4.3 million videos every single minute of every single day watched on YouTube in 2018. When I talk to students, I ask them to break out their calculators and do this math, because it's a very large number. When you do 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks in a year, right? It's a huge universe of content online that's being created. Twitter users sending 473,000 tweets every minute of every day in 2018. And my question was, how much of this is history content? How much of this is content that purports to teach you something about the past? Now, it turns out it's actually very hard to answer that question with any definitiveness, but I've been working with some researchers in Germany to try to get a handle on this. On TikTok, which is not on this graphic, but will be on the graphic I'll show you in a few minutes, on TikTok, last year at this time, there were 58 billion posts with the hashtag history. 58 billion posts with the hashtag history on TikTok at this time last year. So a year later, it's probably over 100 billion. On Instagram, the number was somewhere around 50 million last year. So right now it's probably well over 100 million as well. So history, it turns out, is a huge category of content online. In the English language Wikipedia, there are 6.2 million articles that are categorized as history. That doesn't even include biography. If you include biography, the number is even huger. So it's a huge content of content online about the past, and nobody really had any kind of grasp on what this stuff was and what it was doing to people's understanding of history. So I figured that there was a book here. And in 2019, I wrote the first draft. In 2020, I wrote the second draft. 2021, I wrote the third draft. And the book came out at the beginning of 2022. I've been speaking about this book continually for pretty much the past 2 years straight. This is, I think, my 176th event about the book. The book has been well received, and I put this up not necessarily to pat myself on the back, but just because I like to point out that when I was pitching this book in 2018 to publishers and literary agents, they all told me that no one would read it. They said it was too obscure of a topic, it was too niche, and why didn't I write a book about Trump instead? Well, I'm very glad I didn't write a book about Trump, because that would have been a very boring book, and this book I think is far more interesting. But I think the real question is, why have so many people been interested in this book? And I think the answer is twofold. Number one, we care about social media. We care about social media's effect on our lives. And it turns out that this book actually fills an important gap in our understanding of social media, because it covers a part of social media that no one else had previously looked at. But number two, it turns out that people also really care about history. And one of the reasons that I have been doing all this work with the State Department is because it turns out in every country that they send me to, debates about history are informing geopolitical debates that are happening right now, right? I mean, I've been to Georgia, I've been to Bulgaria, I've been to North Macedonia, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, France, Belgium, Germany. In every single country, debates about history are being invoked in order to litigate questions that are in the public interest and political debates. And increasingly, those debates and those questions are being litigated and debated online. So it turns out if you understand something about how history operates online, it then gives you insight into how debates are playing out in line more broadly around issues that matter to policymakers and the general public. And it also gives you insight on how to participate in those debates, because it turns out there are actually some very tried and true ways of communicating history online that can affect what people know about the past. And disinformation agents take advantage of those, but also communicators from the government and other strategic communicators can take advantage of those. And how that all works is something that we'll get into, and it's something that I talk about in the book. One of the other things that they told me when I was writing this book was they said, you better get it out quickly, because what happens if people stop using social media? Well, people are continuing to use social media. I can assure you about that. This is an updated version of the graphic that I just showed you. TikTok is now on here. You'll see TikTok users watch 167 million videos every minute of every day. I will say that again to let that sink in. 167 million videos every minute of every day are watched on TikTok. On Facebook, users are sharing Facebook Live receives 44 million views every minute. Facebook Live receives 44 million views every minute. If we're doing Facebook Live right now, that means we're one of 44 million videos being streamed right now on that service at any given time. So social media has not gone away, I can assure you that, but it has evolved. And I think what's interesting about this graphic is obviously in 5 years, there's much more of an influence on, video content and photo content. That much is clear. But I think what I think about when I see this graphic is how much of an emphasis there is on live content. right? You think about TikTok, where you can go live, Instagram, where you can go live, Facebook, where you can go live, YouTube, where you can go live, Twitch, where you can go live. I mean, all of these platforms now want you to go live on them, to have sort of branded channels where you're putting up live content or recorded content, where you have a loyal base of fans who maybe, pay a subscription to see your stuff. I mean, if you think about it, social media companies today are really in competition with Netflix and Hulu, right? That's who they see themselves going after. They are as much entertainment platforms as they are posting and sharing platforms today. And so I think that has interesting repercussions. It has repercussions certainly for content moderation, because how the heck do you moderate 167 million videos every minute, right? It's impossible. But it also has implications for how we communicate on these platforms. What's really interesting, though, is that it turns out that the way you communicate history on these platforms actually stays very consistent over time. In other words, what people were doing in the 2010s on Facebook to communicate about history is actually what they do in 2020 on TikTok to communicate about history. It just slightly tweaked for the new format and new genre. My theory is that actually social media teaches you how to behave. And once you learn the behaviors that work on social media, you take them with you from platform to platform. So as we'll see in a few minutes, that shapes how people communicate and talk about history. And actually, it becomes amazingly consistent over time how that works. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's in the book, what I found, and what relevance it has specifically and practically for your work. Well, as you probably could tell from my history communicator's history communication, I like to come up with new words. I like to coin new phrases. And so in this book, I've actually coined a new word, which on the very first page of the book, and that word is e-history. So moving forward, I'm going to refer to all the billions of pieces of content that I just talked about as e-history content. And I'm going to use the example of e-commerce as a way to justify my definition of e-history. So let me just take a glass of water real quick. So in the same way that we have commerce and e-commerce, I'm suggesting that we now have something called e-history. So when I walk into a store and I give someone money and they give me something back, a good or a service, that's an example of commerce. When I buy something on Amazon.com and they send it to my door, that's an example of e-commerce. So what is the difference between the two? Well, obviously there's some overlap. E-commerce can be counted as commerce and some commerce can be e-commerce, but what's the distinction between those two terms? Well, it's very simple. I'm going to argue the distinction is twofold. Number one, the location where the transaction happens, right? E-commerce happens in a digital environment. But number two, I'm going to argue, and I argue in the book, that there are certain mechanisms, certain mechanics behind the scenes that make e-commerce possible, right? Amazon has to have a way to take my credit card information and send it securely to a server. That server needs to be able to talk to a warehouse. The warehouse needs to be able to talk to a driver. A driver needs to get the thing to my door, right? You have to have those mechanics in place in order to make e-commerce possible. And I'm going to argue that the same is true of e-history. There are certain mechanics in place that make e-history possible. And if you understand those mechanics, then you can leverage them to great effect to get your e-history visible online amid the millions and millions and millions of pieces of content out there that are fighting for attention in the newsfeed. And for disinformation campaigns, for example, if you understand what mechanics they are leveraging in order to get e-history visible into people's news feeds, then you can start to teach people how to ask critical questions about that information and help to dispel the effects of disinformation. So basically, my argument here is that e-history is as much about the location, about where historical information is being transferred and communicated, as it is the mechanics behind the scenes that make it possible. And if you understand those mechanics, then you can leverage them and exploit them to your advantage, whether you're a disinformation campaign or a strategic communicator for the government. Okay, so that leads into my definition of e-history, which is on the very first page of the book, which Ingrid has, and she's read, which always makes me really happy. So e-history are discrete media products that package an element or elements of the past for consumption on the social web, and which try to leverage the social web to achieve visibility. Examples of e-history include history YouTube videos, Twitter threads, Instagram posts, podcasts, etc. Okay, so it's a very dense definition, so let me deconstruct it very quickly. The past is a very big place. You can't tell all of it in the small space of your phone. So you necessarily have to take an element or elements of the past and package it into a media product that can be consumed on the social web. And that media product could be a video, it could be an Instagram post, it could be a Twitter thread, but all e-history, all the billions and billions of pieces of content out there are taking an element of the past and packaging it for consumption into a media product that fits online. That's part one of the definition. But part two of the definition, I argue that there is no reason to put anything online unless you want people to see it. If you didn't want people to see it, you wouldn't post it. Now, maybe you want 10 people to see it, maybe you want 10 million people to see it. But all e-history is fighting to get seen in your newsfeed. Because if it gets seen by you in your newsfeed, then it can influence how you think about the world and what you think you know about the past. So the way that e-history gets seen, as I cited earlier, is by leveraging the mechanics of how social media works. Because if you leverage those mechanics effectively, then you can achieve visibility. So all e-history is not only packaging an element of the past for consumption online, but is trying to leverage how the online ecosystem works in order to achieve visibility and get seen by you in your newsfeed. Because if it gets seen by you, then it can shape how you view the world. Now, what's really important here is to note that accuracy of information plays no role in this equation. It doesn't matter if your piece of e-history is incredibly accurate, incredibly rigorous, incredibly scholarly, if no one sees it. If you don't know how to leverage the mechanics of the social web in order to make sure it achieves visibility. And on the flip side, a piece of e-history that is wildly inaccurate, that claims a wildly inaccurate thing, that claims, for example, that like Ukraine was never a real country. I don't know anyone who would make that kind of e-history, right? But if that type of e-history was out there, it doesn't have to be accurate. If it leverages how the social media works and the mechanics of the social web, it can achieve visibility. And in fact, it can achieve great visibility, right? So accuracy is not a prerequisite for e-history achieving widespread visibility and widespread influence online. It's about packaging an element of the past for consumption on the web and trying to leverage the social web in order to achieve visibility. That is what the common definition, billions and billions of pieces of e-history content, that is what they all have in common. So let's go back to this video, which I showed you earlier. This was a very successful, quote unquote, piece of e-history. It achieved high visibility. It packaged an element or elements of the past for consumption online, and then it effectively leveraged how social media works and how it was designed and the mechanics of the social web in order to achieve high visibility, tens of millions of views. So how did it do it? Well, to answer that question, there are a couple of things we need to know about this video. The first thing I mentioned earlier was when it came out. So this video came out in the summer of 2015. Now, people may not be so familiar with American politics about what happened in the summer of 2015, but in the summer of 2015, a white supremacist named Dylan Roof walked into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and massacred 10 people. And when he was found in North Carolina the next day, he had the Confederate flag sewn into his jacket. That's what this is here. This Confederate flag represents the Southern United States that fought in the Civil War to defend slavery, right? So his crime was clearly a racial hate crime. And at the same time, this flag, which symbolized racial hate and racial hierarchy, was not only found in his jacket, but it was also flying above the state capitol in Charleston, South Carolina at the same time. So it prompted this huge debate online and in the news media about the Confederate flag and its role in American history and American life. And so it's not a coincidence that this video came out precisely during that debate, in summer of 2015, right? And it's not a surprise, too, that the video puts the Confederate flag right at the front and center of the video. Right? If I was going to make a video about the Civil War, I could use any number of different images. I could use Abraham Lincoln, I could use Gettysburg, I could use African-American soldiers, I could do any number of different things. But this video purposefully chooses to lead with the Confederate flag, which would have been an image that was circulating online at that time in everyone's news feeds. So this video, in part, takes advantage of something that I call in the book, the newsworthy past. And of course, we're seeing this a lot now with what's happening in Israel and Gaza, right? People putting out all kinds of e-history to try to capitalize on the news cycle. And it turns out that if you can tap into the newsworthy past, you can make your e-history very, very visible. And I say this because if I was to put up a video about the American Civil War right now, with the exact same information that's in this video, how many views do you think it would receive? Not 40 million, right? So timing matters. The newsworthiness, the web and social media, particularly a platform like Twitter, is built with a media logic baked into it, right? It privileges breaking news, it privileges news content. So tying your e-history to the news cycle and breaking news proves to be a very effective way to leverage how social media works in order to achieve visibility for your e-history, regardless of whether it's accurate or not, and regardless of whether I could put out the exact same thing 5 years from now, right? So it's leveraging how social media is built and designed and the assumptions that go into it that actually dictate how e-history achieves its visibility. Not the content, not the accuracy, not even who made it, which would be the other question we need to ask about this particular video. Because this video was not made by a historian, was not made by a journalist. It was actually made by a private company based out of Los Angeles called PragerU. And PragerU is run by a man named Dennis Prager. And PragerU's stated purpose, which is on their website, I'm not putting words in their mouth, this is what they say. Their stated purpose is to counteract what they perceive to be is a liberal heterodoxy inside American universities. It turns out that PragerU is one of the top 10 political spenders on Facebook during this time for conservative causes. So actually, the purpose of this video is not to teach you about the Civil War. The purpose of this video is to use a very newsworthy, headline-grabbing, visually arresting image in order to position PragerU as an authoritative alternative source to academic history. And it worked, because today, PragerU is actually being used in universities and high schools in Florida, Ohio, Texas, other places across the United States. And it's not a U, by the way, it's not a university, it has no university accreditation. So when I talk to students in particular, I'd say to them, listen, when you see history content online, you need to ask yourself, why is this coming out now? Why am I seeing this in my newsfeed at this time? And most critically, what mechanism of the social web is this trying to leverage in order to achieve visibility? So if you could answer that question, then you become a more media literate information consumer online and a historically literate information consumer online. So all of these pieces of history have stories behind them about who created them, why they were created when they were, and what mechanics of the social web they are leveraging in order to achieve visibility. In this great big universe of content online that's constantly being created, e-history turns out to be a very large part of it. As mentioned, there are millions and millions of these e-history videos and blogs and social media posts, etc., competing for our attention, advancing political and commercial agendas, and actively reshaping what we know about the past. And by the way, for those of you on this call, I don't know exactly what you all do. Well, maybe we'll get some time during the Q&A, but you too are probably e-history creators without even realizing it, right? If you've ever posted in your government agency or your embassy or the think tank or NGO that you work with, content about the past that packages an element of it for consumption online and which tries to leverage online to achieve visibility, then you are an e-history creator, whether you know it or not. And so understanding the different mechanisms that allow e-history to become visible in newsfeed could become a very powerful tool in your toolkit as you think about your communication practices. Because there are agendas that you want to advance as well, right? Agenda isn't necessarily is not necessarily a four-letter word. Your agenda could be to advance peace and democracy and human rights, or to, advance the position of your government, or to empower citizens to participate in democracy. That could be your agenda. And e-history can be very powerful at advancing those agendas if you understand how to leverage the mechanics of how the social web works. Now, as I mentioned, e-history can also be created by hobbyists and white supremacists and conspiracy theorists and foreign disinformation agents. So the e-history that you're creating is competing in the newsfeed for visibility around all this other stuff, right? Including disinformation and really hateful content. And what's challenging for information consumers is that they have to determine for themselves which e-history they are going to trust, right? Because a lot of this stuff is not labeled. You could go onto YouTube right now and see a video about the Civil War created by PragerU, followed by one created by a journalist, followed by one created by a white supremacist, followed by one made by Russia Today, right? And you as information consumer have to sort it out for yourself. And when I did interviews for this project, that was increasingly something that I heard over and over and over again from people, is that it puts a lot of onus and burden on the information consumer to sort it out for him or herself, what e-history is what and which e-history can be trusted. And that actually, interestingly enough, when I talk to people, it can lead to a sense of fatigue and a sense of kind of just zoning out, right? People would tell me that, they stare at their screen, they scroll for 30 minutes, they look at all kinds of content, including history content, and then they look up and they realize that they have no idea what they just watched. So this information environment that we're creating, where all this content, millions and millions and millions of it, is being churned out every single day, and all of it is competing for visibility in the newsfeed, right? It can have a very numbing effect on the very people that we're trying to reach. Okay, so in the last little few minutes I have before we go to Q&A, I want to talk very specifically about why some e-history gets seen and why others do not, right? I've been kind of alluding to this the whole time, that there are these mechanisms behind the scene that make e-history visible, that make e-history possible. And in the book, I actually go chapter by chapter to talk about these and how they map onto certain platforms that we use every day. So, as I said earlier, I was surprised to learn when I was researching this book that actually the way people communicate about history online turns out to be very consistent from time period to time period, from platform to platform, even from language to language and culture to culture. It turns out that because of the way the social media was designed and the social web was built and the assumptions that are built into it, that there are very tried and true ways to make e-history visible. And people repeat these over and over and over again on Facebook in 2010s, on TikTok in the 2020s. And so these are what they are. They are in the book. These are what basically the 7 chapters of the book after the first 2 chapters are organized in this way. And I actually mapped them out to the platforms, as I mentioned. So I don't have time to talk about all these right now, but let me just talk about the first 2. So the first one I talk about, again, a new term that I like to coin, is something I call the crowdsourced past. So basically, the web and social media were built to privilege signals of attention. The more attention it seems like a crowd of people is giving something, the more visibility it will get in the newsfeed. This is very evident on a platform such as Reddit, if anybody uses Reddit, right? You put something up on Reddit, this person comments, that person comments, this person upvotes, this person says something, this person likes. Eventually, when it looks like a crowd of people are interacting and comment with a piece of content, it pushes it up into the feed so that when you get to the Reddit homepage, you see the content that is having the most crowd interaction first, right? It gives you the most visibility. So this premise, this logic is built into many of the social platforms that we use. And it's a great way to get your e-history seen. It's also a great way to get your disinformation seen, right? If we think about something like Russia, for example, and what they do, they basically simulate a crowd. They simulate lots of different independent accounts that appear to be unique people or independent people or impartial observers. But they all comment on a piece of content, and eventually it pushes that content up into the feed and makes it visible where it can spill over into other platforms. In the book, I cite an example actually from Japan, where the far right in Japan has a very, let's say, alternative view of Japanese history, right? And so one of the ways that they make that content visible, that e-history visible, is by using platforms such as 8chan and 4chan to crowdsource that information to the top of the feed. And then once at the top of the feed, it can spill over into places like Wikipedia or into politics, even being cited by Japanese politicians. So crowdsourcing is a very effective way to make your e-history visible online, and the crowd can also actually also prevent your e-history from being visible online, right? Because the crowd can basically shut down the historical information that you want to present and make it so that it never sees the light of day. Now let's talk about the next one, nostalgia on demand. Did you know that the Facebook platform, the Facebook algorithm, the Facebook newsfeed was actually purposely designed over time to privilege nostalgic content? If you're thinking to yourself, oh yeah, you know, I really do see a lot of nostalgic content in my Facebook newsfeed. I see a lot of old photographs and a lot of like on this day stuff. There's a reason. Like Facebook was actually purposely designed to do that. I talk about it in the book, how that evolved over time. Didn't start out that way, but it evolved over time to be that way. And so if you're thinking that, you know, nostalgia seems to work pretty well on Facebook, well, you're right. It was, you know, it's actually a great mix, a great marriage between those two. The types of content that pulls at our heartstrings, that makes us think that it was better, you know, earlier, that times were better before, and the way the Facebook newsfeed works to privilege that types of content. And what's really interesting is that people who are really good at weaponizing nostalgia turn out to be like dictators and authoritarian leaders, right? Because they will always tell their followers and constituents that things were better in the past, right? There's always this longing for empire. Russia has this longing for empire. China has this longing for empire. Right now in the Balkans, there's this Yugo nostalgia where, you know, this idea that life was better under the Tito dictatorship, right? So there's always this yearning for the past that goes along with these authoritarian impulses. And it turns out that that is a great combination with Facebook, because if Facebook has 2 billion people and widespread penetration in places like Bulgaria and North Macedonia and Georgia, and authoritarians and anti-democratic forces are using that platform to sow nostalgia into the population and make people distrust Western governments and think that life was better before the EU or before democracy or before this or before that, it can be a very potent, powerful political weapon. So it's not a surprise then, as I've traveled, where I've seen this play out very firsthand. You know, in places where there is this sort of growing nostalgia, this yearning for dictatorship, it's also places where there's widespread penetration and use of Facebook and where people rely on Facebook for their information and for access to the internet. So this is a very concrete way, I hope, of seeing how this all plays out in practice, right? The mechanics of the social web, the e-history content that gets created, and how it affects political debates, geopolitical debates, issues that are in the public interest, right? Leveraging these different mechanics can actually make this content visible, and it can also prevent certain content from ever reaching the light of day and affecting how people see the world. Now, I could talk forever about this because it's a subject that I care a lot about. I have examples in the book that go through all this: nostalgia on demand on Facebook, the viral past, the visual past, the newsworthy past, the storytelling past, and even talking about artificial intelligence, right? How much content right now is being created by machines and how that's being used to leverage social media to achieve visibility. But I don't have any more time because I want to save about 10 minutes for questions. So let me just wrap up by saying that you know, this is something that we're continually still working on and trying to figure out. I mean, with billions and billions of pieces of content, with social media evolving and changing all the time, with new platforms emerging, you know, it's a continual challenge to think about how the history online affects the way people view the world, and how people who are in the position of trying to use the web to do good can leverage these types of things in order to get good e-history and just general good content out there, leveraging what the social media has to operate. So that's one of the reasons why we've created something called the, History Communication Institute. We have about 150 people from around the world who are now working together in a Slack group to think about different ways that we can make interventions with policymakers, with tech companies, with academics, with students. We feel like there's a whole area of media literacy here that needs to be reconceptualized, that takes e-history into account as part of media literacy training. And then obviously there's ways to work with policymakers if they want to create e-history content and leverage the web effectively, whether it be embassies or strategic communications people inside MFAs or NGOs, et cetera. And of course, we also want to understand the types of disinformation campaigns that are out there that are leveraging e-history and why they're having success or why they're not, and what we can do to counteract them. So there's a lot of work that they feel like the HCI can do. It's a very new organization, but if you're interested, here's how the ways you can stay in touch with me and get connected. I have a website, I have a newsletter, and then the History Communication Institute is historycommunication.com. So thank you for your support. Thank you to Ingrid and to Matt for inviting me to be part of this. I'll leave this slide up here in case people want to take down my information. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to chat.
Thank you so much, Jason, for your lecture. That has been like extremely interesting. I really suggest you to read Jason's book. It's great. So where you're going to find like more about things that he talked about today. But yeah, there was like one thing that came to my mind is like, you know, as we navigate this ever-changing landscape, we are kind of like reminded of the importance of critically examining the challenges basically presented by the digital era. So, and that's one thing that we all need to consider. So are there any questions for Jason? Okay, everyone's super quiet.
I'll kick one off to encourage others to do it. And Jason, I mean, there's throughout all of our trainings and all of our work over the last 6 years, we've also very much hit on the point that there are common modalities and common tactics and common approaches and common behaviors across social media platforms, that even within a platform across cultures, you know, there's economic incentive to encourage people to behave a singular way, whether that's in the US or whether that's in the Czech Republic. And that a lot of these behaviors are kind of copy pasted, again, with economic incentive from platform to platform. They don't really change. And yet, after 10 years of governments really being engaged in social media, they do have a hard time either identifying those mechanisms. So I think your book chapters are going to be super helpful in that. At least they've been able to identify those mechanisms. But I think really even, and I can speak to the experience of my own government, we do recognize that, but we have challenges in being able to consider them. How would you, for some of our, because I do see some of our people are government communicators, I do recognize a few names. Hello, everyone. How would you recommend, say, a limited resourced Ministry of Foreign Affairs or a limited resourced Prime Minister's communications team go through the process of being able to game out and think out strategies in order to leverage those mechanisms when they themselves are, say, under pressure to be able to put something out in, say, 3-4 hours? Are there any sort of processes, policies, procedures that you think could be codified ahead of, say, a need to message that could be deployed, or anything that you've seen successful in your travels and your work that would allow them to go through those 7 pretty quickly and be able to put out something that is responsive in that manner?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, sorry, I just got a message that I thought was an emergency, but it's not. Yeah, it's a great question. I think, first of all, one thing I didn't get to in my talk, which, you know, when I have more time or when I'm speaking with a slightly different agenda, I will get to, is one of the other arguments I make in my book is that actually a lot of the social media that we use are purposely designed to take power away from experts. And that includes experts in government, right? When you think about Wikipedia, for example, which is the first sort of example in my book that I talk about, or even a platform like Twitter/X, right? So one of the very fundamental basic principles of those platforms is to try to take power away from people like journalists, scholars, and government officials and put it in the hands of citizens, right? So it's not the historians who do the history, it's the citizens. It's not the journalists who break the news, it's the citizens. It's not the governments that get to have a say in thing, it's the citizens. And so I think that's one of the reasons why my book has been read by so many people beyond just academics, is because people recognize that that at heart, all expert-centric disciplines and all expert-centric communicators face an uphill battle using these platforms, because literally the platforms were designed to take power away from those types of people. And so I think that forces us to ask some more difficult questions about how do you do expert-centric communication in a ecosystem that is designed to take power away from experts and empower users. And so that's why you see something like the Biden administration, for example, create this Office of Digital Strategy, headed by a guy named Christian Tom, and send Christian Tom to a conference like VidCon, which is video creators who do stuff on Instagram and TikTok, and try to recruit internet creators to be surrogates and advocates for the White House's message, right? Because that leverages the user centricity of the way the web is designed and the fact that it tries to take power away from experts and puts it in the hands of users. And it also leverages the way that the web was built to be purposely crowdsourced and to privilege the voices of the crowd over the voices of the single subject matter expert. So I think part of it might be cultivating surrogates in the way that the Biden administration is trying to do right now, in the way that the Trump administration did in the past, to find ways to get the message out there, but not necessarily have it come from a position of a governmental authority or a subject matter expert, but more from the type of voices that the internet and the social web tend to privilege. And then thinking very strategically about how each of those messages on those platforms has to be constructed and packaged in order to make it the most attractive and the most visible in the feed.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We've also given a lot of time and a lot of thought to how we can build these kind of, it's cliche to call it, but these kind of influencer networks. But you're absolutely right. If the kind of flip side of the democratization of content production, the democratization of media, is that it erodes the power structures that were formerly and formerly in place, then being able to tap into individuals who benefit from that democratization and bring them to your side is a strong case.
Very well said. Yes, very well said. Yeah, and of course, if people have other questions or they just want to send me emails, that's totally fine. I'm happy to correspond and liaise with people offline. I don't know what time of day it is for people, so people might be, getting ready for bed or, wherever they are in the world. So I'll just put my website contact form in the chat too, and if anybody wants to follow up, happy to chat offline.
Okay, thank you very much. If someone still wants to ask a question, maybe because Matt opened the floor, you're more than welcome. Otherwise, you can just, as Jason suggested, send him an email if you're just too shy to talk in front of other people. So, however, Jason, once again, really thank you for this lecture today, and thanks everyone for being a part of this. As I mentioned at the very beginning, this is the first one, the first lecture in the series of virtual lectures. So stay tuned, and we're looking forward to further discussions and discoveries in the future. So, hey, have a great afternoon, morning, or whatever, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.